Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed, Part 3 Q&A. I'm very excited. It's actually Monitor Steve's birthday. We didn't mention that Part 1 or Part 2, so that's a bonus bit of information that's completely non-relevant.
Happy birthday, Steve. Nice.
I wanted to bring it up because for my birthday present, Tim's going to answer all the questions while I sit back and interrupt him and try to throw him off his game as much as possible. So that's what's happening here. Yeah. But before we do that, today's video sponsor is Thermal Grizzly and their Cryonaut Extreme, which is now available in a 2-gram syringe. This high-performance thermal paste delivers maximum thermal conductivity thanks to an extremely small particle size and layer thickness. It's also very flexible, capable of standing up to sub-zero temperatures for extreme overclocking, but also performs exceptionally well for air and water cooling applications. So if your CPU or GPU needs repasting, then I suggest checking out the Thermal Grizzly range. Link is in the video description.
As PCIe bandwidth increases with each version, do you think there could be more GPUs with ×8 instead of ×16 lanes? It could hopefully cut costs on low-end GPUs, which don't necessarily need the bandwidth, and leave more PCIe lanes available for other devices, but would you rather they stick with ×16 for more bandwidth on older platforms? Interesting question, given Alder Lake will be supporting PCIe 5.0, so I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, look, I prefer, especially sort of the mid-range to high-end cards, to certainly use all available lanes because of the backwards compatibility of PCI Express. So we're not going to assume that everyone's got a PCI Express 4.0 or 5.0 system. There will still be plenty of people using PCI Express 3.0 for some time to come, and that can introduce a whole heap of performance-related issues when they use those products. And realistically, the entry-level products where maybe it's okay but still not super keen, those products are more likely to be put into PCI Express even 2.0, 3.0 slots. So yeah, if you start running into weird performance-related issues there because of bandwidth limitations through the PCI Express bus, then that's just annoying. And I'm not really sure how much of a cost saving it even is. There is obviously some sort of cost saving associated with it. Whether it's worth it or not, we'll probably never know. But I'd rather that, like in the example of the 6600 XT, I'd rather AMD ate the margin rather than gamers put up with a sort of potentially gimped experience on PCI Express 3.0, which it certainly will be in another year or two. Okay, how much sample-to-sample variation do you guys expect in the products you review, especially for object testing that can be somewhat faithfully recreated by users? For example, my 5900X, so stock settings, seems to be performing 6% below what reviews showed on average despite very similar test conditions. CPU still meets spec, but where does one draw the line between having another issue/bottleneck and just having a poor sample? Sample-to-sample variation, I've seen like virtually none when using like a CPU, say a 5900X, and I buy another one for a friend 4 months later and give it a test out on the same motherboard with the same BIOS. Very, very little difference. Same thing with even graphics cards. Like you can buy, when I do the roundups, for example, like that's a perfect example probably to answer this question. I've got about 10 6600 XTs to my right on the floor, and I've tested all of them. And when matched clock for clock, you get the exact same FPS, like it's margin of error, maybe a 1 to 2 FPS variation. So with graphics cards, plenty of reviewers have proven it now that there's just no variation. Any reviewers that are showing a variation that's significant, there's probably something wrong on their end. With the 5900X, it's really hard to compare your 5900X with our results and claim that that's a sample-to-sample variation, because it's very likely you could if I gave you my 5900X and you stuck it in your system, you would get the exact same numbers, like the exact same numbers. The variation is going to be BIOS revisions. Are you using dual rank memory, like we test with, because that does make a big difference.
Even just what apps you're running. Cooler. Like are you running it in a test system, or are you running it on your normal PC configuration that has 20 different RGB utilities open?
Ambient temperature. There's got to be quite a significant difference there to make the sort of differences you're talking about. But maybe it's a hotter room. Maybe the memory timings, the tertiary timings aren't as tight. You add all these things together, and that can quite comfortably get you to 6%, which really is a very, very minor difference when we're talking about, frame rate differences and things like that. It's a couple of frames at most, generally speaking, within, if you're not talking about hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of frames per second.
Yes.
Yeah, so I think sample-to-sample variation, not something you should really worry about for the most part.
Yeah, I tend to see... I think the most sample-to-sample variation of any of the products that we test is probably on the laptop side. You would have seen in my...
What about monitor colours and stuff like that?
I'll talk about monitors in a moment because there is a bit of variation there as well. I think with the laptops, you would have seen in our reviews that we don't test the individual laptop models anymore. I think it's more effective and more valuable information to more generically test the CPUs because that covers you for a wider range of products. And a lot of those results are an average of multiple different laptops running in the exact same configuration. So if we receive, let's say, over the course of our testing, 5 different Intel Core i7-11800H laptops, then we'll average all those results together. And generally, even though there could be completely different systems from different vendors running different stuff, once we do our power normalized stuff, generally the difference between the best and the worst results is like within 5%, if not, maybe in the rare cases on some models we've seen maybe up to a 10% difference, but generally it's pretty small, which is great. It makes that testing actually worthwhile. Obviously, then the laptops can run all their OEM stuff that will change the power limits and do whatever. But if you're running in the same conditions under the same sort of test methods, again, the difference is pretty small on those. And then with monitors, I've tested multiple different, some monitors I've tested 2 of the exact same model over time. And for things like response times, the difference is very small, very, very small. They almost always perform exactly the same. But monitors do have, they do vary in performance based on the temperature of the monitor. And this is very key for testing, is to keep the ambient temperature of the room the same, because if it's really cold, monitors perform slower. If it's really warm, monitors are faster. So it's very important to make sure, if you are going to compare monitors like that, that you've let them warm up for several hours to make sure they're running at a steady state temperature and testing in the same ambient conditions. Otherwise, there will be some differences there. And then obviously outside of that, there'll be some differences in color performance based on, the panel variation from the factory and that sort of thing. But it tends to be fairly small, and the characteristics of the monitor, like for example, let's say they get the gamma wrong, generally that's going to apply to all of the monitors. You're not going to see one monitor that has perfect gamma and another that doesn't, or one monitor that has, a super wide color gamut and another that doesn't from the exact same brand. That tends not to happen. So generally what we show in the reviews will be pretty close to what you'll get, which is good, because that means that the variation is low and you get accurate numbers. Okay, Steve, in Australia, the 6900 XT is sometimes cheaper than the RTX 3080 and RTX 3080 Ti. Is it a value buy?
This comes back to the 6800 XT versus 3080 Ti video I did recently.
Yep.
Pricing has changed substantially since I made that video. Not so much in Australia, more I would say for US shoppers, pricing at Newegg changes, but it really does change. Seems almost hourly over there. In Australia, I think we're looking at, I've got a few notes here, $2,300 for a 1600 XT at the moment for an in-stock card, mind you, not a cheap listed card.
Yep.
And that's about what you'd pay for a 3080. A 3080 Ti is like $200 more. So that's like it's 8%, I think, more expensive or something like that for the 3080 Ti. So less than 10% either way. I don't know, what's the benefits of the 600 XT? You get more VRAM. Rasterization performance is about the same. Probably better at lower resolutions, but at 4K they're about the same. But you miss out on the more mature ray tracing support, the NVENC, DLSS 2.0. So I don't know, is it worth saving around, let's just say 10%? Is it worth saving 10% on a Radeon GPU that has similar rasterization performance and more VRAM, but you lose like the more mature ray tracing? And the thing with ray tracing, Tim and I could have an hour-long discussion about this in a totally different thing, because I feel like a lot of people don't quite get, even though we've explained it at length over years, our stance on ray tracing. And I think when we're discussing these ultra expensive high-end graphics cards that can actually deliver an acceptable level of performance with ray tracing enabled at like 1440p with the other quality settings turned up, so it's not a compromised ray traced experience, I think then ray tracing does become relevant. Also, there's a whole much more depth to this conversation. We of course have many more ray tracing titles now that do look quite impressive, or at least decent with ray tracing enabled, like Cyberpunk 2077. You can quite easily tell the difference on reflections and stuff with ray tracing enabled, and you are going to get a much better experience with a 3080 Ti opposed to a 6900 XT. So if that's something you care about, is saving 10% worth going from, an acceptable level of ray tracing with some improved effects to just terrible ray tracing performance that you can't really harness. It's
I
sort
think
of first generation.
Just my personal opinion, I think the margin isn't significant enough to go with the AMD GPU. Mm-hmm. I think it's kind of that classic high-end buyer's decision where if you're buying the high-end market, you tend to have a fair bit of disposable income. Like if you're spending over $2,000 Australian on a GPU, you probably got a bit of disposable cash lying around. So yeah, spending 10% more, $200 more is like, I'd rather just get the best of the best product. And in my opinion, the 3080 Ti is the better product overall than the 6900 XT because of the things we've just been talking about. So if the 6900 XT was more like $2,000, so a $500 difference, then you start that's a big question mark there. That's certainly getting me thinking maybe I'll go with the AMD card. But as we've been sort of talking throughout a lot of this generation, when the margins are small and we're talking high-end cards where people want to buy the best, being just slightly cheaper, I don't think is cutting it with these sort of products. And for me, I'd be going the NVIDIA GPU.
The cons and pros column, the pros of the 6900 XT are very slim. So look, it's got what, 6 gigabytes more of VRAM over the 3080, and honestly, I'm not concerned about the 3080's VRAM buffer. And then 3080 Ti, it's like 4 gigabytes more, which is pretty insignificant once you're getting up around 12 gigabytes. For the life of the card, I can't see that 4 gigabytes playing really a role there. So, I think for the 6900 XT to be the go-to option there, it's got to be at least, I would consider it at $2,000. A $500 saving is reasonable. Again, it's not that much money when we're talking about $2,000 plus, but it's enough to consider it because you are getting very similar or the same rasterization performance at like a resolution like 4K. Have you ever found a game that provides great data for benchmarking but found the save system makes the game unusable for repeated benchmarks?
Red Dead Redemption 2?
There's definitely... It's not so much... Well, the save game is annoying there because you can respawn sort of all over the place or in the general vicinity, and then you've got a few times. I know, like where I test, I know there's 6 different checkpoint locations, and I know when I'm at one which route I have to take to get back there. But that is annoying, but it doesn't make it unusable. Probably the day-night system makes that more difficult for repetitive benchmark. So there's definitely quite a few different challenges there with Red Dead Redemption 2, and that's probably the game that would come off the top of my head as well. But there's been other games where you can't save at certain points, and like that point in the game is where you want to benchmark because it's significantly more demanding than where you actually like the safe zone, let's say.
Yep.
And you don't want to be playing a game for 5 minutes to get to where you want to benchmark, and then maybe you can only make one pass because you can't actually go back. So there have been games like that. They're not coming to mind right now because generally we just have to give up on them because there's no way of benchmarking them where they're useful. So they get deleted, which is a shame, but there have certainly been some examples. Thankfully, It's not super common, but I think it's less of an issue now than it used to be. There used to be a lot of games where for whatever reason, they just weren't suitable for benchmarking.
Next question. Will Intel's upcoming GPUs have POSCAPs? What do you reckon, Steve?
MLCC caps is, oh God.
Or they're going to use the good caps or the bad caps?
Yeah, the bad caps. I don't think we'll see that one come up again. Hopefully Intel GPUs don't have stability issues straight off the bat where we have to come up with some kind of theory as to what is causing that. But yeah, moving right along. Not asking for a crystal ball, so you can put it down, Tim.
Good. Nice.
It's not required for this one, apparently. But, maybe do get it out. What are your hopes for Threadripper 5000? Do you think we'll see some entry-level Threadripper processors below 24 cores? I'd kind of expect them to mirror what we saw with Threadripper 3000 in terms of core count. So what did we get with that? We got 24, 32, and 64, right?
Yeah, I don't think there was a 48
right?
core model. So I think that's right.
No. They're the 3960X, 3970X, and 3990X.
Yep. Yeah, that's right.
WX. It's been too long since I looked at those. We didn't do much follow-up content, though they were extremely impressive. I expect to see the same thing. This is the short answer. When and whatever, crystal ball stuff. But yeah, that would be my expectation.
Yeah, I don't think there'd be too much of a market for the 16 core variant because they've got the 5950X. So
that's right.
That's really the buy a Threadripper CPU when you're planning to also buy a Threadripper CPU in the future. Like I guess I can't quite afford the 24 core model yet or 32 core model, but I still want to be on the Threadripper platform. With the price of the motherboards and stuff these days, it doesn't really make sense to do that. Like the boards are so expensive that you really do want to just jump straight up to the level of performance you need. And being a workstation type product, generally speaking, the buyers are going to have the budget in mind that's going to afford, all the things that you need for your Threadripper system, including the thousands of dollars worth of memory and everything that is required. So,
yeah, I think for most people, the entry level is probably going to be the 32 core, to be honest.
Yeah.
But the 24 is there if it's you want the quad channel memory or the extra PCI Express lanes or whatever it may be. But yeah, I think that's I think it's pretty safe to say that that's going to be the situation there. But we'll find out. Also, as you mentioned previously, I think in an earlier Q&A, at this point we believe that the TSMC 7nm yields are exceptionally good. So there's not going to be a whole lot of defective dies where they could possibly make the equivalent of like a Ryzen 3 3300X version of a Threadripper 5000 CPU that only has like 16 cores enabled. So probably not going to see it.
And they'd probably be better off putting that in a consumer product anyway, given the lack of models below $300. Obviously they'd make more margins on Threadripper, but at the same time they're leaving that market open. So yeah. As an amateur GPU overclocker, I often found myself in situations where the OC is stable in 3D Mark and some games, but quite unstable in other games. I'm curious, what are your go-to games to confirm GPU OC stability before putting them into the blue bar graphs? So yeah, what games do you use?
Well, I've stopped putting them in the blue bar graphs as much as I can because for reasons that I've discussed in that content, generally moving forward, I'm reserving the GPU overclocking stuff to the day one reviews, just as a sort of for science test, look at what could be possible, at least with our one sample. But to answer your question on what I use, generally I find one or two new demanding games like a Cyberpunk 2077. I used Tomb Raider for a long time there. The F1 just the F1 games, let's say, are good because you can put them on loop. So you can just have them looping around because generally I'll find like a demanding area in like a Cyberpunk game where there's NPCs walking around that and I'll just leave it there. And generally if it passes that, it's pretty good. But sometimes you can find when you start moving around and interacting that it changes the load and then you can run into stability issues. So your best bet is just to use a whole heap of different games. But that's two reasons I've sort of got so bored, especially with GPU overclocking, is because you're spending all this time and effort to squeeze out like 10% more performance. Like
if you're lucky,
15% would be, if you're lucky, 15 would be huge, and it's not. So maybe 10% more performance from a factory overclock GPU, and you're risking stability for a handful of extra frames. I don't know, I just find it not worth the time, energy, and the risk involved of crashing during a game, because there's nothing worse than finally getting to sit down and play some games, enjoy maybe a multiplayer game with your friends or whatever it is you enjoy doing, getting 5, 10, whatever into it, and then having it blue screen or reset. Nah, not up for that. That sucks. So I'm just not going to risk it for the few extra frames. And then in our content, I've dropped it because, again, the overclocking of an AIB card can vary quite a bit within that model, depending on how good the silicon quality is. And generally, you're not measuring how good the cooler is of the AIB card. You're measuring how lucky you were with the silicon lottery.
Yep.
And even then, the variances aren't going to be huge. But, if I'm saying the Asus Strix card overclocks 5% better than the MSI Gaming X Trio, that's really based on my one sample of each card. It could easily be flipped the other way if I bought two other cards. So I've stopped doing that because people were focusing too much on the overclocking potential to make that purchase, when really the MSI card might have been a lot cheaper and have a better cooler, but it didn't perform as well in our sample of one overclocking. So I've just decided to drop that. Too misleading, not accurate enough, and
good
GPU
idea.
overclocking being what it is just, yeah. So we'll move on.
In your own personal systems, how much importance, if any, do you put towards power consumption of the CPU and GPU? What extent of relative performance lead do you feel makes the extra power draw worth it? Hypothetical example, GPU A performing 15 to 20% faster than GPU B, but consuming 45 to 50% more watts. So personally for me, I've never placed that much importance on power draw. Certainly not from a power cost perspective, because generally the running cost of these sort of systems is not really worth considering in most, like even Australia, which has fairly high power rates. I don't think it's, compared to the price of the system, it's like, not too much of an issue. The main thing would be the heat output that I'm more concerned with. But even then, most of the time, I think the heat is fairly manageable. It's only now that I've got a Threadripper 3970X, which is a 280 watt CPU, I believe, the 32 core Threadripper model. And I've got an RTX 3090, which is a 320 watt GPU in the same system. Am I sort of thinking, I'm probably on the limit of like the thermal capacity of my desktop in terms of like the noise level that I want. Because ultimately what it comes down to is how much heat am I putting out? So how painful is it going to be to use my system in like a summer high ambient temperature? And also how noisy is it going to be, because you're pushing out so many watts into that system, you need more fans, you need to run the fans at higher speeds. And even with a very power hungry CPU and GPU, I'm still not quite at the level where it's unacceptable yet. So from that perspective, I guess most of the time it doesn't really matter, and I would just get the more powerful components. What would you say about this?
I thought you were going to say the thermal limits of your desk.
Yeah, it's running red hot. It's that much power.
Tim can't touch it. He's got to type like this at the risk of touching his stovetop. Well, now that Tim's finished flexing on our audience with his 3970X and his 3990, it depends. Obviously, Tim and I aren't the best people to ask this question because it's sort of a time is money situation with us.
Yep.
We'll favour rendering time over efficiency to get the content out to you guys as quick as possible, or
absolutely
minimise the amount of time we have to sit at the computer. So if it was a gaming computer, personal gaming system, again, it depends. Like, if the extra 20% performance meant that I could get an acceptable level of performance for, say, maybe 4K gaming or high refresh rate 1440p gaming, but I had to, smash the power consumption by 50% or whatever, it's like, well, I'm willing to do that because I need that extra performance. But, if there's a similar GPU that will give me the same sort of performance, but, consume a lot less power, then maybe I'll go with that, because while the thermal output's one thing, it's always also the operating volume. So do you want a screaming loud computer that's pumping out tons of frames, or one that's nearly as fast but nearly silent? So personal opinion thing, and for me, there's no one answer. For me, it completely depends on what I'm trying to achieve and what I'm using it for as to which way I would go there.
Yeah, I think that comes down to, it's like, how important is the volume, operating volume?
Mm-hmm.
Are you in like a high ambient temperature environment, like say Southeast Asia or other countries where 30 degrees Celsius is a fairly normal temperature to be running your computer in? And how expensive are your power costs, or are you running like an off the grid setup or off solar panels and batteries or something like that? I think that's when, for me at least, the power consumption figure makes the most sense. If you're just talking about performance and you've got plenty of headroom like a lot of desktops do, then this scenario and many scenarios, it's not too much of an issue. Nick asks, we are at the point where the highest end cards from AMD and Nvidia are more than capable at running games at high refresh 1440p, and 4K monitors are a tiny portion of the market. Would you expect new generations of cards to lean more heavily on new features rather than performance in order to sell? For example, DLSS, direct storage, ray tracing. Interesting.
Well, I was just going to jump in quickly and say, I would think no. It depends. Like, I don't know how well ultimately Turing sold and how popular it was, but Turing was a generation that really did rely on these new technologies such as, well, DLSS and ray tracing, namely. And most tech enthusiasts, myself, Tim included, weren't super excited about Turing because, well, DLSS didn't turn up for a while and ray tracing was... opinions will vary on that, but we weren't super impressed with the Turing generation of ray tracing support, at least in the lifetime of that product. So, yeah, I mean, it's good to see strong uplift in rasterization performance or just general gaming performance, and I think that's certainly what we're going to see with the next generation, and they're just going to use these features that they've now established to help sell those products, help sway people towards their brand.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think when it comes to features, it's incredibly hard to get a feature to be adopted straight away. So if you've got, like, let's say the next generation of GPUs, they have an entirely new feature that we haven't thought of. It looks really cool. It's new. It's some sort of crazy thing we've never seen before. The question is always with GPUs, how is that going to be used? And as we've seen with many, many generations, usually it's not used to begin with. So a lot of people, I think, rely on the performance of the cards as kind of the baseline. Like, you want a card that performs well, that performs better than your current generation GPU to even consider an upgrade. Like, how many people would buy the same performance tier of GPUs to have access to things like DLSS and ray tracing? We've sort of seen that interest is lukewarm at best on that sort of thing. So,
yeah.
And I think, while it is true what you're saying that a lot of cards these days are capable of high refresh 1440p as an example, and 4K is a tiny portion of the market, there's still a lot of realms for which performance can improve. For example, there are still games today that don't run at, say, 200 FPS. And you might say, oh, you don't need to run a game at 200 FPS. That's ridiculous. But if you have a high refresh rate, 240 hertz monitor, running a game at 240 hertz is a big upgrade from 120 hertz. You can definitely notice the lower input latency. You can notice the increased smoothness. And then on top of that, with the current monitors that we have, you actually get a clearer visual experience because the monitor doesn't have as much motion blur just from how it's runs as a sample and hold display. And then, of course, on top of that, you got ray tracing as kind of the next frontier of performance. So while cards might be acceptable for rasterization at 1440p today, you enable ray tracing, it might not be acceptable. And certainly we need, it's not just we want, but we need significantly more powerful ray tracing cards to get fully path traced games in the vein of, say, a Minecraft or Quake 2 RTX. If you want more of those games like that, but with, modern geometry counts and texture quality and stuff, we're going to need, quadruple the power of an RTX 3090. So there's still plenty of room for that. And then obviously higher resolutions, newer games are going to come out and require more VRAM and all those sorts of things. So I definitely don't think it's as much of a, we're at the limit of what cards need to be. I think there's still plenty of area for performance to get better and not necessarily have to rely on features as much, even though that is still going to be important.
Yeah, 100% agree with everything you said. Also, new games are going to continue to look better.
Exactly.
So
100%. Do you think Intel's Arc being fabbed by TSMC will hinder AMD and NVIDIA's ability to get enough wafers? I'm wondering if this was part of Intel's calculations, some sort of nefarious plot to hurt their competitors. It might hurt AMD quite a bit if they can't get enough supply to meet demand on the CPU side of their business, leading to a loss of market share again. So we sort of talked about wafer allocations with, I think we had a question previously, not sure if it's been previously in the order that we're doing these questions in the Q&A, but about 5 nanometer supply.
Somewhere.
So I think with this question, obviously this is more a 7 nanometer, 6 nanometer type question. It's not going to hinder their ability because the contracts for these things are sorted well in advance. So if AMD and NVIDIA want to buy lots and lots of wafer capacity, they've probably already done that. So Intel buying the dregs of the supply that's left to them isn't going to have any effect. And for the future as well, a lot of these companies like TSMC, they tend to make preference or give preferential treatment to major returning customers. So if you've got an Apple or an AMD or Qualcomm or NVIDIA, they know that they're going to be buying hundreds of thousands of 5 nanometer wafers, and they're likely to buy hundreds of thousands at 3 nanometers and 2 nanometers and 1 nanometer and all the future generations. So keeping those big customers happy is very important, and that's why you often see companies like Apple and AMD, which has been growing and growing and growing, find it very easy to have massive wafer allocations. And Intel having their own fabs as well, it's unclear whether TSMC is going to want to give them any sort of preferential treatment if they're only using them for one generation. Like they might come in and make their Arc GPUs on, let's say, 7 nanometer and then 5 nanometer, then switch back to Intel fabs. Well, TSMC's lost a customer. Do they really care about, the long-term partnership that they've got there? So that's going to play into it as well. So I'd say that, it's not... The volumes that Intel are going to be shipping with these GPUs is probably going to be pretty low. I don't think it'll have that much of an impact on wafer allocation, and it would have been planned ages ago. So wouldn't worry too much about this, and I think wafer allocation is going to be pretty much a non-issue in the next, in a couple of years from now, which is kind of how it was back, 5 years ago. Did we ever really talk about, NVIDIA not getting enough TSMC supply for their GPUs? Wasn't really too much of an issue. So at some point in the future, it'll resolve itself, and it'll just be business as normal.
Okay. That's a bit sad. It's the end of the September Q&A.
Yep.
I'm a year older, and we've done another series of Q&As. But there was a lot of good questions this month. A lot of different ones, which again, it's the same thing we had last month. So I don't know what's changed.
Good to get variety.
It is good to see. It is, it's really cool. So I'm not sure why we're seeing such a variety now, whereas early in the year, I guess it was the whole crypto thing and prices, and that's all anyone could focus on, and now everyone's kind of bored with that, and we've just moved on to back to regular questions.
Yep.
But anyway, it's good to see. You do love to see that. So I'm looking forward to next month's Q&A, and next month, new studio. So that's also very exciting.
Nice.
Nothing's happening with Tim. Tim's doing monitors
just
and things.
Regular times over here.
Just classic Tim stuff. But anyway, Floatplane, Patreon, if you're not signed up to those and you want to get more of Monitor Steve and Tim, then links in the video description, as Tim is indicating towards. Floatplane gives you the occasional early access to the stuff that goes on the main channel, and Patreon's just kind of the same stuff, but not the early access. But you will get access with either of them to our exclusive Discord server. We have an awesome community there. Tim's always chatting about hashtag monitors, and I don't know, I'm just all over the place.
Getting the Neo G9 fixed in there, that was a lot of fun the last couple of months. Well, Tim talks with you guys and works out issues and gets your feedback, and it's a really awesome community. I think we mentioned live streams. If not, we do live streams. Tim and I get together live streams, behind the scenes content, and Q&As. So anyway, if you're interested, check it out. If not, perfectly fine. We appreciate you guys watching, especially if you've watched to this point, because what does that mean, Tim? That means you're part of the 20% club, and that means good watch time on the video. So always enjoy that. Thank you for watching until the end. And I guess that pretty much does this one. I'm your host, Tim.
I'm your host, Steve. See you next time.